Welcome back to Homeroom. My name is Paul Turner, Social Studies Coordinator for Kansas City Public Schools. Today, we're here to talk about radical Reconstruction, the benefits of the South, what happened in the aftermath of Reconstruction, and basically moving forward. Today, you're going to need a pen and paper. Let's get started. So, what do we know so far about radical Reconstruction? Well, what do we know so far about Reconstruction period? We know that Abraham Lincoln died in 1865. And basically, we know he was replaced by President Johnson. Remember, President Johnson didn't have too many friends. He was one of the original guys from the South that stayed with the Union. That's what made him basically a good vice president and helped keep the Union together. The questions that we're going to answer today. What was the legal and constitutional issues that arose basically after the war? What should be done with the free blacks in the South after the Civil War? And how and should the Southern states be reintegrated back into the Union? And what should be done with President Davis and other Confederate leaders after the Civil War? And who would lead this Reconstruction effort? So, we're going to get started with radical Reconstruction. 1867, the United States was, the South was broke up into 5 distinct districts. Basically, these districts were run by the military. Basically, they ran the Freedmen's Bureau. They ran all these organizations that basically promote black help in the South. So these organizations, they were run by generals. General Schofield ran basically 1. General Sickles ran 2. General Pope ran 3. And that's this large portion over here, which is talking about Alabama, Georgia, and basically Florida. General Orden ran 4. That's going to talk about today's Arkansas and Mississippi. And 5 was run by General Sheridan. Basically, that was today's Texas. So the radical Republicans. Let's talk about Thaddeus Stevens was the leader of them. This is Thaddeus Stevens. Basically, he thought Lincoln was too lenient, basically, on the Confederacy. He thought they should pay a higher price. He thought 50% of them basically need to take a loyalty oath, basically, to the Union. So this basically was a huge deal. Because you remember Lincoln's plan, only 10% had to take this oath, right? Loyal to the Constitution of the United States. But the radical Republicans, they wanted 50% of the population to do so, right? So, when Johnson took over after Lincoln died in 1865, he ran with Lincoln's plan. You remember, he vetoed basically all these Republican-backed bills. As Republicans started sending these bills up for civil rights, basically for black suffrage and all this other stuff, he was vetoing these bills, right? So, he wasn't too popular. Remember, most of those states in the South, they hadn't came back into the Union yet. So, again, this whole process was basically just, drawn out process to get them back into the Union. He entered the Freedmen's Bureau, right? He told them no. He basically was not a friend of the black man. He was telling them that basically they're good. He said, let the states handle it. Again, he was more of a states' rights guy compared to the radical Republicans. You remember, African Americans were loyal to the Republican Party close to 100 years after the Civil War. It went until basically 1965 where we started seeing that switch where African Americans moved to the Democratic Party, right? So, what should the radical Republicans do? Election was coming up. 1866 was a huge year. Huge year in American history, right? The next 2 years in American history were huge. From 1867 to 1869 were huge. So, 1866, Republicans had this huge landslide. So more come to basically to the House of Representatives, to the Senate. Guess what happened? So now, see all these bills are getting vetoed by Johnson. He had the highest veto percentage of any president so far, right? It was some 71%. Basically more than anybody put like Washington, Jefferson, Lincoln all put together. So, Republicans sought to expand their power. That's what they did. As all these new basic congressmen started coming in, they had a veto-proof power. So, guess what? If Johnson vetoes a bill, they could get it passed again because they had a veto-proof power. They basically, the South now wanted political power, right? Guess what? All these people in the South, now you have African Americans started coming about. You have, these white people just coming about because they took the oath. Said, you know what? I'm taking an oath to the United States. So they started wanting more power too. Then they ended up trying to remove the president from his position. we're going to talk about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. So, let's get started. Constitutional issues that came up, right? The 13th Amendment. This ended slavery in 1865. So now, emancipation happened, right? After the Civil War. Remember in the South, as they started going through the South, those slave states basically started coming over. Now, we're talking about those border states, places like Missouri. They actually had to abide by the 13th Amendment that ended slavery, right? The 14th Amendment came in 1868. They gave black citizenships, right? So we talk about, Plessy versus Ferguson. That's going to happen in the future. But we're going to talk about all these other things that have happened. This is black gaining their citizenships basically under the Constitution with the 14th Amendment. This becomes huge moving forward in history. We're going to talk about gay rights. We're going to talk about all these other rights. We're going to talk about basically women when they gain the right to vote. This all happened because of the 14th Amendment, guys. The 14th Amendment is probably the most important amendment in the United States, right? Under the Constitution. The 15th Amendment. This gave black men the right to vote. This also, we lost some allies during this process too. It happens a lot, guys. Sometimes, one set gets like the right to vote or something like that. Other people can become upset because they're not getting the same rights, right? So let's talk about the unintended consequences, especially with the 15th Amendment. Unintended consequences, basically, understand that the abolitionist movement, this movement happens from all the way, the freedom of slavery happens from start like of the United States in 1770s, right? This movement was basically trying to free blacks, right? And it was women that helped lead in this process. Women will help lead in this process, right? But black men gained the right to vote. Oh crap! Stop.
What happened?
I started scrolling down.
Okay.
Okay. All right.
Go back on that one.
Yeah, I'm gonna go back to this one.
All right. Here we go. 3, 2.
So let's talk about the unintended consequences of the 15th Amendment. Understand that women were part of this abolitionist movement, right? They wanted blacks, to be free. They wanted all this stuff. But women won the right to vote, especially white women. It's true. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and all these other movements and these leaders, basically, they won the right to vote. African American men gained the right to vote in 1869, right? So, this infuriated the movement. So, a lot of your leading, basically, women's rights movers, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and all these other figures, they basically turned against this. They didn't want that to happen first. So they were friends with people like Frederick Douglass. And you saw this, basically, this clash. As Frederick Douglass said, yes, they are my friends. He says, my people come first. So you saw the split when it came to basically the black movement compared to the women's rights movement. So now former allies become enemies through this whole process. Now let's talk about basically about the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, basically, again, nobody liked Andrew Johnson. People in the South thought he was a snake. People in the North didn't trust him. So now, where's his political base? He really didn't have one, right? So, the impeachment of Andrew Johnson. It started, basically, he fired Edwin Stanton. When he fired Edwin Stanton was basically, he was the Secretary of War. The Secretary of War was basically telling Congress that this guy can't be trusted. He's basically a spy for the Congress, right? For the radical Republicans. He was a spy for the radical Republicans. So understand that Andrew Johnson didn't trust him. So he fired him from the cabinet. So once he did that, that triggered basically a congressional review, basically investigation. So once that happened, the radical Republicans knew that they had blood in the water. All this other good stuff that happened basically during the Johnson years. When we talk about the end of French hopes in Mexico, the review of the Grand Army in 1865, the purchase of basically Alaska from Russia in 1867, the Nebraska being admitted to basically the Union in 1867, the Reconstruction period, the amendments getting passed, the Civil War amendments, and the Great Eastern Atlantic Cable in 1865, that all happened during his administration. So all the good that we talked about, that he may have done while he was the president, basically went out the window. So Congress ended up impeaching him, right? the House of Representatives, they said, you know what, we're going to send him to trial. The Senate, led by 7 Republicans, decided not to convict him. Those 7 Republicans never ran for office again. Their political career was over. The party was done with them, right? So those guys were done. But he was still the president for the next few years, right? He was a weak president. Congress basically had a veto-proof margins so they could go around him. They didn't need a president during this time. He was a weak president. He was wounded. So we know about Reconstruction. We know what happened with Lincoln. We know what happened with Johnson. We know what happened with the radical Republicans getting Civil War amendments passed. We talked about Thaddeus Stevens, right? So let's talk about the lasting impact of Reconstruction. Let's talk about the short-term gains for African Americans. Remember, we had our first African American congressman, right? And this was huge. We basically taught lots of African Americans, over 200,000 African Americans, how to read and how to write. So the short-term gains are huge, right? But the long-term impact basically was one of poverty. We're going to talk about the sharecropping system, correct? The sharecropping system, remember we talked about that a week and a half ago. The sharecropping system, basically, people were bonded to the land. So the lasting impact becomes over 100 years. So it's a reason we're going to talk about the Civil Rights Amendment in the 1960s. Because the sharecropping system basically left people bonded to the land. So it's much like slavery, but a little bit different, correct? So, let's answer some questions, right? What was the legal and constitutional issues that arose after the war? We're going to talk about basically black male suffrage, right? African Americans gained the right to vote. Great issue, right? Then we're going to talk about the women's rights issue. White women didn't get the right to vote till 1920, correct? Then, did the lives of free blacks improve during Reconstruction? For the short term, yes, right? The short term, they did improve, correct? But on a long-term period, we still had to basically have the civil rights movement close to 100 years down the road. What happened to the old Confederate members after the Civil War? So with the 14th Amendment, remember, that one gave African Americans the right to citizenship, right? But the 14th Amendment also stripped away the Confederacy's basically right to vote. So if you were like, Jefferson Davis, he lost his right to vote. He lost his right to be basically a citizen of the United States, right? To participate in open elections. So that's what happened to the old Confederacy, right? So they actually lost their rights as men to be a part of the United States. Compare the two plans. Which one was more effective? Compare Lincoln's plan compared to Congress' plan, the radical Republican plan, right? Which one would you think is more effective? Personally, I like the aggressiveness of the radical Republican plan. They basically wanted to punish the South, which they ended up doing. But in the long term, it ended up hurting them, right? Because those state legislatures, as they kept coming back above, they started denying African Americans the right to vote. They started denying African Americans the right for employment. So then we talked about the Jim Crow system that started coming back because of that, right? So the radical Republican plan was great for the short time. For long-term periods, I can understand what Lincoln was thinking. He wanted to keep that union together. So, we talked about radical Reconstruction. We talked about what happened to the former Confederates after the war. We talked about the aftermath of Reconstruction. Now, this is what I want you to do. This is what you're going to do, right? You're going to look at the legacy of Reconstruction. Write one paragraph over some things that left basically over from American society over Reconstruction. I want you to think about some of those things. I want you to think about some of the racist attitudes that start coming forward because the legacy of Reconstruction. I'm Paul Turner, Social Studies Coordinator. Today we talked about radical Reconstruction. We talked about basically how it wrapped up. We talked about the long-term impact of radical Reconstruction. Now, I want you to think about that as we go forward and how that affects American society. Talk to you guys next week.